And you don't have the network that does that. It does not exist. This is where we were with the hospitals. We came up with what we call surge and flex. What happened with the hospitals when this started, we started seeing these much higher numbers that would overwhelm our hospital system. Well, how do we ramp up the hospital system? You don't really have a public hospital system. Downstate New York, you have about 100 hospitals. You only have about 15 of those 100 are public hospitals. The rest are all private hospitals, voluntary hospitals, but they're all private hospitals. We had to get those private hospitals to work with government in a coordinated way. Never happened before. Extraordinarily difficult. We did it, but it was a phenomenal undertaking. You now have 300 laboratories and hospitals across the state that do virology testing. How do we get 300 private labs and hospitals to become one system statewide to do testing for COVID? And how do we get them more coordinated? This is something that has never been done before and is going to be a tremendous undertaking. Also, to further complicate it, what they will tell you now, because we've been having the conversations, the labs, if they can get the test, which they have to purchase from private sector companies, the tests require certain chemical reagents to operate. So you take a sample and then you mix it with other chemicals. They can't get the chemicals that they need to mix to do the test. Well, who has the chemicals? No one has the chemicals because everybody has been overrun with demand, and the chemicals come out of where? China, where everything has come from over the past 40 days. Everything goes back to China. And China is now in a position where they're being asked globally for these reagent chemicals. And that is a piece of the equation that I can't figure out. And that's why the federal government has to be part of this approach and part of this answer. I can do what I can do on the state side, and I will. And I'm going to issue an executive order that says the Department of Health will be coordinating those private sector labs, which are private sector companies, but they're licensed by the state of New York. They're permitted by the state of New York. And we need them to step up and work together. But the federal government cannot wipe their hands of this and say, oh, the states are responsible for testing. We cannot do it. We cannot do it without federal help. I'm willing to do what I can do and more, but I'm telling you, I don't do China relations, I don't do international supply chain, and that's where the federal government can help. Also remember, the federal government at the same time is developing testing capacity. So we wind up in this bizarre situation that we were in last time, 50 states all competing for these precious resources. In this case, it's testing, and then the federal government comes in and says to those companies, I want to buy the tests also. This is mayhem. We need a coordinated approach between the federal government and the states. Second thing that is of immediate concern is we have to stabilize the finances of the state. The federal government has passed 3 bills to address this crisis. Of those 3 bills, the state governments have gotten precisely 0, zilch, nada in unrestricted aid. The state should this, the state should this, the state should this. Yes. Well, what support have you given the states? None. I mean, how can that even be? How is it even plausible as a strategy? It doesn't work. We need financial resources to stabilize the states, because when you starve the state governments, I still eat, Dr. Zucker still eats, but we can't fund schools, we can't fund hospitals, we can't fund small business, We can't fund all these extraordinary efforts that we're undertaking. It makes no sense. We need to support the states because the states are the ones who are doing this.
They're holding on to a 400-point gain. Now, HUD Secretary Dr. Ben Carson, he joined the show earlier. He says they're looking at potential options to address Americans missing mortgage payments during the pandemic. We're on that story some more after this.
Approach. Okay, it's up to the states, but then don't ask the states, don't give them this massive undertaking that has never been done before, and then not give them any resources to do it. That's not how this is going to work. The expression, don't pass the buck without passing the bucks. A.J. Parkinson, Mark remembers him. Don't ask the states to do this. It's up to the governors, up to the governors, up to the governors. Okay, is there any funding so I can do these things that you want us to do? No. That is passing the buck without passing the bucks. Passing the buck, which is the opposite of the buck stops here. The buck doesn't stop here. I'm passing the buck. And I'm not passing the bucks. I'm not giving the financial assistance to actually perform the responsibility. So, last point is we go from today to tomorrow, but we talk about the new normal. This also has to be an opportunity where after this horrendous period that we have gone through on every level, after the exorbitant cost of this, the personal pain of this, the death of this, this has to be one of those moments in time when we look back where we say society transformed. It was a learning and growth and transformational period where growth and evolution was accelerated. Yes, society took a terrible blow, but it became a moment of reflection where all sorts of new reforms and innovations happened. That's what we have to do with this period when they look back at it. So our goal is not, let's get up and turn the machine back on and keep going the way we were. No. How do you make the changes now that you've been talking about in some cases for years, by the way, but you never had the political will to do it, or it was too hard, or it was too difficult? We talk about environmental changes that we're going to make, but we never really do it. We talk about issues of income inequality, but we never really get there. You know, we talk about changes to our public transit system, but it's too hard, it's too controversial. All right, well now you have an opportunity in this window to really make changes and reforms and improve things in a way you haven't. And by the way, if you went through this, and you went through this pain and aggravation and suffering, and you didn't learn, well, then shame on us. Then shame on us, because there are so many lessons to learn. And then you come back better than you were. 9/11, New York took a terrible beating. This nation took a terrible beating. We learned from it. We grew. We're better. 9/11 transformed the country. If I told you before 9/11 you were going to take off your shoes when you went to an airport before you could get on an airplane, and they were going to go through every bag and every, you would say, I'm never doing that. 9/11 said this is a different world. Look at all the security measures we now have post 9/11 that we would have never envisioned. We went through Hurricane Sandy. We didn't build back what was. You build back better than before. You take that moment, you learn that lesson, and you improve society. We have to do that here. And we have to do it affirmatively. It doesn't just happen. You have to say, we paused, New York pause. You paused. You reflect, you learn, you grow, and you move forward. Look at what we learned about the public health system. You know what we learned about the public health system? There is no public health system capacity. Hospitals had the number of beds they needed to operate. Well, what in case of an emergency? There was no emergency capacity in hospitals. Nobody had beds left empty. Oh, that wing is in case there's an emergency. Then we would use that wing. It didn't exist. Why not? Well, that's not what we did. So, how do you improve the public health system? How do you improve the emergency response? Well, we never had to deal with a pandemic before. By the way, what is a pandemic? Okay, well, now we did. And now let's learn. And how are we going to be ready for the next situation like this? Because there will be another. I don't know what it is. I don't know when it is. I don't know if this virus comes back in a second wave. But there will be something. And we have to be ready and better for it. And not just what you learned, but what have we been talking about doing that we should be doing that this is now an opportunity to do? We've been talking about reimagining the workforce and workplace. Does everybody actually have to drive into the office every day? Or did we learn that there are ways to telecommute and work from home where it's actually more efficient, it's actually more effective? What do we do about a transit system? And how do we make it safer? Not just the way we've been talking about, but also from a public health point of view. And how are we now smarter about public interactions? I can't tell you how many doctors now have come to me and said, you know, I've said for years we shouldn't be shaking hands, that it's just a total way to transmit germs and viruses, etc. So how do we take this moment, since we are paused anyway, and actually come back smarter? I also believe it'll work. It's a moment of personal reflection. You know, we've been in a different circumstance. We've been in a different circumstance vis-a-vis our family. What have we learned during this heartbreak and during this crisis? I've spent a lot of time with my kids, 22, 25, twins, two 25s. My interactions with my kids had gotten so superficial over these past few years. You know, everyone's busy, busy, busy. So what do you need? Everything good? You need anything from me? When do I see you? I miss you. That was the same conversation, like over and over and over. Now I got time to sit with them and really have in-depth conversations that I hadn't had in a long time. And I'll tell you, one of the things I learned is I was missing a lot. You know, they're not 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 years old anymore. They're grown up. They have complex lives and complex feelings and complex situations. And you don't understand that or get to appreciate that when all you say is, how's everything, anything you need, when do I see you again? You know, well, I was busy. It's my defense to myself. I was busy. Yeah, except that's not an excuse. And take a deeper reflection on what's important in life. And you can't have a real quality relationship with your child or another human being unless you take the time to get below that surface and really understand the person and really take the time to talk through what's going on. People don't work that way. They don't open up in a 4-minute conversation. So now I wind up in a situation where I have a couple of hours to talk to one of my daughters. And there's a whole person and life and nuance that's going on that, frankly, I had been oblivious to. I'm not going to let that happen again. I haven't been able to see my mother. She's a little older, and I see a lot of people. I'm exposed to a lot of people. I don't want to go see my mother because she's in a vulnerable population, and I'm out and about a lot. So it would be careless to go see her now. But I think about all the times I have said to her, she lives in Manhattan, she said, can you come over for a cup of coffee today? How many times I've said, yes, I'll come over for a cup of coffee, and then called back and said, I can't do it today. Next time, next time, next time, next time. Why? Well, because something came up, I was busy, I didn't have the time. Wrong. That was more important than anything else. Sometimes you don't miss something until it's been taken away. And it made me rethink what was important and what I had been missing. And I'd been missing a lot because all this, we're all busy. Yeah, what does it mean at the end of the day?
Okay, so you've been listening to Governor Andrew Cuomo. He's getting a little more personal now with his reflections about where we are in this crisis, but some important data points.
On behalf of Highlight, everybody in the tri-state area and the rest of the country, I really, really appreciate and thank you for what you are willing to volunteer to do.
You know, that's really good stuff. I love to see America coming together, thanking the frontline workers, and that was United Airlines pilot doing just that. I think that's really good stuff. Now, I just want to bring in the company for a second because I've got a question here. Okay, I'll go to first to Lauren, then Susan, then Ash. First of all, I will not have Ben & Jerry's ice cream in my freezer. Lauren, what kind of ice cream you got?
Oh, I have 5 Ben & Jerry's. I have 2 half-baked. They have a half-baked with peanut butter now, and I have another one. I can't remember the name.
Real fast, Susan,
I'm
what you got?
stocked full with ice cream, and then Lewin is my favorite.
Okay. Ashley, we got time for you?
Don't know what it is, but I'll eat any
Don't have
ice
time.
cream.
Neil, it's yours.
Why not Ben & Jerry's? It's the politics of the guys. They're delicious ice cream. You tried the chunky
Yes, of
monkey?
course. They're socialists. Tell them. They're socialists.
Okay.
Gosh.
But delicious. Delicious. All right. So thank you very much, Stuart Varney, on that. Now I know his ice cream habits. I feel like I know him very, very well. All right, we've got that. We've got a market rally going on here. We were up better than, 600 points for a while, now about 375. And a lot of this is Boeing coming back here big time. In fact, it counts for about a third of this on the notion that it's going to resume commercial jet production next week. Now, we don't know how many jets. We don't know which ones are going to be built. But we just know for Boeing, which has had a raft of troubles over the past year and a half or so, to say nothing of the virus shutdown here, that this is welcome news, certainly for the markets. And of course, the biggest advance today is this Gilead Sciences drug that is showing promise or could be effective against the coronavirus itself. There are a number of other biomedical concerns that are also involved in the hunt for a vaccine or a treatment. There are a variety of them out there, half a dozen as I was coming up here, and I will explore that a little bit later, but it's what Gilead is doing right now that's getting a lot of attention. As we've stressed so many times here, regardless of the stimulus around the virus, what will really move the markets and consistently has proven to be the case is progress on dealing with and or treating the virus. So this Gilead news is big news indeed. Jackie DeAngelis on that and much more. Hey, Jackie.
Hey, good afternoon to you, Neil. That's right. There is optimism in the market today to close out the week. And yes, since the highs in February, stocks are definitely lower. Take a look at some of these numbers. The Dow off just under 20%, the S&P down 16%, the NASDAQ off around 12%. But since those bear market lows, we are seeing green. You can see the Dow is up almost 30%, the S&P 26%, and the NASDAQ up 25%. So in some ways, it's a tale of two markets here. But you mentioned the Gilead trial, and that's really important today, too. Optimism about the coronavirus, about treatment for it. There's some reports out there that this drug trial Gilead has been doing might be effective. The University of Chicago did a phase 3 test that showed test patients saw rapid recoveries using the treatment, but it looks like those results were leaked. Gilead is not actually commenting on this. And the danger with trials, of course, is that they are incomplete, they're inconclusive, they're trials. But still, investors taking this in a sign of hope that things are going to get better, that something could be on its way. And that would mean we could get the economy going a little bit faster as well. And that's what the stock market watches for. But as you mentioned, there are at least 21 other companies that are working on therapies, vaccines, vaccines, treatments, and the results in terms of how these stocks are performing are different. You've got some double-digit gains there, and then you've got some stocks that are trading lower in the red. But we've digested some bad news this week. Jobs, 22 million people out of work, retail sales saw that plunge. Larry Kudlow this morning saying, yes, second quarter is going to be pretty awful, and May is going to be a transition month. But you know what? The market has priced that in, and they actually like the honesty in terms of how the timeline is going here and how things are progressing, Neil. So that's why you can see we're trading up 368 points on the Dow.
Well, they're definitely looking for some promise at the end there, or at least that they're working on multiple possible treatments there. That's good enough, certainly for the markets for the time being. We'll see if it pans out. Jackie, thank you very much. Jackie DeAngelis here. Let's get the read on all of this from Dr. Tom Price. You remember him, the former Health and Human Services Secretary under President Trump. He joins us right now. Secretary, good to have you. We don't know much about, this particular drug from Gilead. We do know that others are working on similar remedies, Sanofi, and I could go on and on. What do you make of what you're hearing right now? Sometimes to get to fruition, to get past clinical trials, it could be many months, up to a year. Oh, yeah. No way of knowing, but what do you know?
Well, this is fascinating because what we're watching right now is the research and development of a new drug or drugs playing out in public, which the public never sees. This isn't an exact science. It goes in fits and starts, and I think it will give folks an opportunity to gain a much greater appreciation of the challenges that exist. But it's going to be a long process. There'll be a lot of setbacks, and folks need to be prepared for that. And it's important not to get frustrated, and that patience and cooperation in all of this in terms of the infectious disease is the byword. It's incredibly important, and that's not necessarily the strong suit for a lot of folks.
Doctor, when we hear a company like Moderna is getting, I think, about $483 million in federal funding separately for a virus vaccine under development, how does the government make those calls, or what does it see? And from your days running HHS, how do you sort of say, all right, this looks promising, this looks like it might be worth some government, help to push it along? How do you decide that?
Well, an incredible amount of work goes into that. That money is coming through the NIH, through the National Institute of Health, and scientists are looking at all of these studies that are going on in real time over and over and over. And when they identify something that they believe shows significant promise, then that's where they put resources, because those resources are obviously finite. In Moderna's case, NIH obviously sees something that demonstrates to them that there may be promise with a vaccine through that company, and consequently they're putting greater resources. Now, the resources that have been brought to bear on this on COVID-19 are really important for the American people to appreciate, because what that means is that there's going to be a whole lot of opportunity to look at more and more treatment options and vaccine trials that need to go forward, because we don't get to the end of all of this until we have a high quality treatment and or a vaccine that will make it so that folks have immunity to it. So what folks are watching is just the normal routine process of scientific development, research and development of new medications, new drugs coming online, but it's being played out in public in a way that we've never seen before.
You know what's interesting, too, that let's say you come up with a vaccine. I know it's not easy, to your earlier points in interviews as well. But once that happens, then you got to get it out to the public. Now, Sanofi has said it can mass produce a vaccine if this particular vaccine it's working on works, to the tune of 600 million doses come next year. But that means the vaccine's out in this particular case, but then you wait for the company or companies involved to mass produce it. So it's quite a multi-stage event, isn't it?
It is. And we see that, frankly, play out every single year with the normal influenza, the flu vaccine. Every fall, there's a new vaccine that comes online, and the work that's been done in the prior year to figure out what's the best way to formulate that vaccine. And then there are millions and millions of doses that are produced so that we can be safer as it relates to influenza, which again it continues to be a severe challenge for not just the United States but the world every single year. So vaccine companies, Sanofi and others, clearly have the capability to produce hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines once we determine the one that is going to be most effective for the coronavirus, which I think we will. I think that will come. This is not something that's the coronavirus is not something that's absolutely new. This is a new kind of virus, but it's not a new family of viruses. But remember that we don't have a vaccine yet for the common cold, which is a coronavirus. So some viruses allow themselves the opportunity to make a vaccine against, some don't. And that's what this science is that we're watching in real time played out in public.
As a doctor, and then going beyond your days in Congress and running Health and Human Services, do you feel that it's inevitable, even though it might be economically important, that when we get back to unwinding some of these stay-at-home provisions, that there will be a spike in cases, that's unavoidable?
Well, I don't only think it's unavoidable, it's actually the natural course of a new infectious disease. The first step in all of this is mitigation, which is the physical distancing that we're undergoing. Then the next step is the detection, the testing, to make certain that we know who has it so that you can then trace those individuals and the people that they came in contact with. Then treatment, and then prevention of the vaccine. But in that process, obviously, there are going to be some false positives. There are going to be some false negatives. There are going to be, again, this isn't an exact science. And so there will be individuals who believe that they have immunity, who the tests have shown they have immunity, that will likely get infected. And then you'll have the potential is for another spike. And that's the normal course for new infectious diseases. So would not be unusual. In fact, we ought to anticipate that. And again, that's why I said patience and cooperation is absolutely the key, because that's what's required of a population in order to get through a new infectious disease.
Secretary Don Brice, thank you very, very much. Good catching up with you and learning a few details about how this will all roll out when it does come to that. Tom Price. All right, well, we already know that the president has already said in this reopening plan for America that the governors will eventually call the shots. And you might be noticing that some of them are doing it in large groups in the Northeast, the likes of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, et cetera, out on the West Coast, California, and Oregon, and Washington State, and now in the Midwest with the likes of Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan, et cetera, kind of joining forces to see how they would respond collectively as a geographic group to all of this. Grady Trimble following all of that from Chicago. Grady.
And Neil, the president encouraging each state in the different regions of the country to work together. But in the Midwest in particular, there's growing frustration. There have been many protests of people calling for the rollback of those restrictive stay-at-home orders. Today in Minnesota, in just about an hour, there's a protest planned, another one planned in Kentucky, and there's also one expected in Missouri early next week. Of course, these protests follow that massive protest in Lansing, Michigan, as thousands of people showed up in their cars and trucks to protest Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-home order there. The president tweeting just moments ago, liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, and liberate Virginia, and saying yesterday he understands each state's frustration.
It's been a tough process for people. You know, I told you there's death and there's problems in staying at home too. It's not just, isn't it wonderful to stay at home? They're suffering. This country wasn't built on that principle. It was built on an exact opposite principle.
More on the Midwest states forming that coalition to reopen their economies. I want to show you a map that illustrates that their stay-at-home orders kind of all end at different times, so we won't see one mass reopening. For example, Republican Governor Mike DeWine of Ohio, he plans to reopen the state economy on May 1st. Governor Whitmer in Michigan was asked about that timeline on Good Morning America this morning.
I do hope to have some relaxing come May 1st, but it's 2 weeks away, and the information and the data and our ability to test is changing so rapidly, it's hard to tell you precisely where we'll be in a week from now, much less two.
And when states do eventually reopen, Governor DeWine stressing that they're going to look very different from what we were used to before all of this happened. For example, social distancing will still be in place. Many people will be wearing masks, and there will be physical barriers at some workplaces as well. Neil?
All right, Grady, thank you very, very much. There are a lot of criteria the governors are free to sort of seize on to justify a decision to slowly reopen their states and eventually the entire nation. One of the things they look at is a decline, at least in the increase in cases and in deaths. But this can be sort of like a dicey issue, especially when we're hearing from New York Governor Cuomo right now that statewide total hospitalizations, which is, if you think about it, how all of this starts, they tick down again. Now, this is where it starts, where you are carrying or testing positive of the virus, and it's serious enough that you have to go in the hospital. Those hospitalizations, the entry point, if you will, into a saga of treatment, has slowed fairly dramatically in New York. The lagging indicator, and I know this sounds a bit macabre, are deaths, and they are increasing at a rate right now that is not, to the governor's liking, satisfactory. In the latest period, they rose by 630 on April 16th. That would be yesterday, versus an increase of 606 the day before. It is not unusual, doctors that tell me, that you will have a continuing jump in deaths, even as the entry point, the number of hospitalizations, continues to go down and down from what it was the day before. So you're going to get competing data, one showing an increase on a daily basis in the number of deaths versus an improvement, a fairly dramatic one in the case of New York. This is being played out in a lot of other states as well, where the hospitalizations themselves are declining. These are the kind of things that governors have to weigh when they decide if and when to open things up. Tim Pawlenty joins us right now. Of course, you remember him, the former Minnesota governor, presidential candidate, the former Financial Services Roundtable CEO. Governor, always good to have you, and thank you. I'm wondering if you were back in the state mansion, executive mansion, and you were looking at some of the criteria that would decide when you kind of reopen or get your residents back to some semblance of what they had before. I know it would be very different. What would you be looking at? What do you think governors should be looking at?
Always good to be with you, Neil. And of course, this is a classic balancing test between, on the one hand, human health balanced against our economic health. And it's not a one-size-fits-all exercise. That's why having some variability across the country is probably a good thing, because what's happening in Manhattan may be geographically and from a human health standpoint very different than from what's going on in a remote part of Wyoming. Similarly, different states are going to hit their peak challenge point at different times. So in terms of the roadmap or the framework, do we have adequate testing? If it's not ubiquitous, is at least adequate to make sure we have the ability to detect in real time developing patterns? Number two, are we making sure we don't overwhelm the healthcare system? Number three, are we making sure we have plans in place to protect and continue to emphasize